This is not a place in history where there was any confusion about what God could do. But man had completely lost the concept of who God was. Nobody had a clue who God was, how God was, His personality, His nature, His demeanor. Nobody had a clue who He really was. They just understood what He could do. And so while they were crying out for what He could do, God's crying out for them to know who He is. 2,000 years later into church history, and we still struggle. As people fill up churches, clearly knowing what God is capable of doing, and crying out for God to come do these things in their life because they know He can do it. But how many people are on a quest, on a journey to discover who God is? The Christmas story is simply God showing back up into humanity to try to get a message across to them. Here's who I am. Man had developed a very unhealthy fear of God. I mean, as the Bible says, that we should fear God. In fact, it's the beginning of all wisdom. If you don't fear God in a healthy way, you can't really walk with God. You can't, you're just really not going to have much of a connection. But there's a healthy and an unhealthy fear of God. There's that respectful awe of who God is. But then there's that scary fear. It's like, don't get too close. Don't show up too much in our church services. Don't let things get too out of hand. We need to be kind of quiet. We don't need anyone to get too close. We don't need anyone to get too demanding. We don't need anyone to start operating in any kind of spiritual gifts here. All that stuff gets way too scary when that happens. They had developed an unhealthy fear of who God was. I know what it is to fear God on multiple levels. I've been through all those things. I've jumped through all those hoops. I was raised in Pentecostal churches where most of us were in church because we had an unhealthy fear of God. We were scared to death what would happen if we didn't make ourselves become His servants. We saw Him as a cruel taskmaster. We saw Him as creating us and saying, all right, it's this simple. Love me and go to heaven, or if you don't love me, you're going to burn in flames forever. Didn't really seem like much of a loving option to us. But that's all we knew. That's all we were taught. That's all we were ever told. As I was growing up as a child, even at a young age, the Lord was trying to teach me about the fear of the Lord and just being in awe of who He is and all His grandeur. And understanding He's the creator of the universe. And man, I just came from the dust of the earth, and I need to always be aware of that. And at the same time, an equal awareness, but I am your son. I am your child, you are my daddy, and I have no fear that you will do anything bad to me. You are a father who brings nothing but good gifts to their children. And somehow I need to embrace both of these at the same time. I know what it is to be in the presence of God on multiple levels, even to the point of where the presence of God becomes so manifest and so real that I become frozen in it. On my deathbed, I will never forget when I was 12 years old. And we had so many children in our house, and my parents just had a huge heart for foster children. And they opened up their home, and through the years there was 40 or 50 children that my parents took in and raised with us at different times. And it always meant a full house, and we were scrambling to try to figure out where we were going to hang kids on hooks. And I was one of those kids, by the way. And we had a little back porch, and it wasn't very big. It was about, it was maybe about 8 by 8 at the very most. And so they decided we're going to turn that into one of those little bedrooms, and they're going to close it all in and put some windows in it. And so my parents decided, well, that's going to be your bedroom now, and you can have a little privacy. And it's like, yeah, little being the key word here, 8 by 8. And we were even out of beds, and so we had this chase, like you would put out on a deck to lay out on. It was redwood, and there was a whole redwood set, and that was my bedroom furniture. And there was a little pad, and that was my bed for a few years. And that's nothing that should make you go, oh, poor boy. It's like, I thought it was cool. To be very honest with you, I just thought it was cool as cotton candy, man, to have my own little room and that little bed right there. And my body wouldn't be able to take it now, Vaughn, but then it was fine. 12 years old, and I was sleeping one night, and I was having a dream. And in the dream, I was in my classroom at school, and I was back in the back of the classroom with my buddies, and they were telling jokes. They were just telling jokes, and I was sitting there listening to their jokes, and they weren't good jokes. They were bad jokes. And in my dream, you ever had a dream, but in your dream you still had full awareness of emotion and thought, and even at times you're dreaming and you know you're dreaming? And sometimes it's so real you don't know how to separate it. And I'm in this dream, and it's a very emotional dream. And as these boys keep telling jokes, and they're laughing, and I'm sitting with them, and suddenly I hear a rumble coming from outside, coming from the skies, and it's rumbling. It's getting louder like thunder, but it's just continuing. It's not stopping. There's no break. And I'm sitting here in the back of this classroom, and I'm looking at my buddies who are just laughing, and their laughter is getting louder and louder. And in my dream, I'm understanding that's not a good laughter. That's why is that laughter so scary and unappealing? It's like, why am I being repulsed by it? Why do I want to get away from it? And the rumbling outside gets louder and louder, and it crescendos to a point, and it stops. And God wakes me up from my sleep, and I open my eyes. And the only time in my life that God spoke to me in an audible voice. Wasn't dreaming, wasn't asleep anymore. And He spoke to me. And it was that day that He called me into a life of ministry. And He spoke some things to me that it wouldn't do any good for me to tell you, because they would make no sense to you. But to me, He spoke to me how I understood what He was saying to me. And He was calling dibs on my life that night. He spoke just a couple sentences, and He stopped, and it was all over. My body became frozen where I laid. I broke out in a sweat, and I couldn't move. And I laid there for I don't know how long. I don't know how many hours it was. But I was laying there when the sun came up, and I was frozen. I could not move. I was frozen in a holy fear, because as a child I understood God just spoke to me. It wasn't like Him speaking to me in a dream. It wasn't like Him speaking to me in the still small voice. It wasn't like when He spoke to me through His Word. This was something unique. Very historical in my life. And I'll just be very, very honest with you. If God never speaks to me again in an audible voice like that, it's fine with me. It's perfectly okay. There's something about the truly manifest presence of God. And you understand that you are in the presence of something that cannot be facilitated within your emotions or your mind. I know what it's like to have different levels of the fear of the Lord. But at this point in history, the fear of the Lord was a very unhealthy thing. God knew that. God saw they had no clue who He was anymore, and that is why He sent Himself in the form of His only Son to remind us of who He was. Because we were afraid. He was only trying to bring good news. He was only trying to help us understand you're blessed. You walk in my favor. He was only trying to help us understand, look, I'm hearing every word you're saying, and I'm answering your prayers. I'm on the spot, man. I'm on the scene. I'm there for you. And yet, we were afraid of Him. The Christmas story is a revelation of who God is. Not just what God can do, but who God is. God's plan, His original plan, to have relationship with us, completely, 100% depends on us relating to God. Does that not make sense? Can you have a relationship with someone you can't relate to? Can you do it? No, you cannot have relationship with someone you cannot relate to. That's why it doesn't matter how much you love your puppies and your kitties. I don't care how much you love them and how emotional it may get for you. You can never have genuine relationship with an animal. Why? Because you can't relate to them truly, and they can't really relate to you. Just when you think, boy, we're on the same page here and we're flowing, you walk in the bathroom and they're sucking water out of the commode. You go, you know what? You and I are not the same. And your first thought is, I can't relate to that on any level. There's people that we could truly never have a relationship with because we can't relate to them. Their mindsets, they're just out there. At least in our opinion, they're out there, man. I could never have a relationship with someone that thinks like that. God understands. This whole thing exists for you and I to have a relationship. You cannot have a relationship with me if you can't relate to me, and you are no longer relating to me. You know what I can do, but you don't know who I am. So the Christmas story begins to evolve because God is reminding us who He is. I love this passage in Philippians chapter 2. Just a couple verses here, 6, 7, and 8. Speaking of Jesus, Paul says, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made Himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, He humbled Himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Paul is saying, you know what? He, God, humbled Himself and became one of us. Why? Why did God humble Himself and become one of us? Because apparently it was going to be the only way He could show us who He was. It would be the only way. And He comes through His Son, Jesus Christ. And from the very beginning, the earliest stages of the Christmas story, God is trying to paint a clear and concise and detailed story of who He is and how He is, making Himself relatable to the average Joe like you and I. Everything that happened was unrecognizable by those living in Israel, because when God came, God was not who they thought He was. He's the Messiah. He's the King of Kings. He'll be on a horse. It'll be white. There'll be a crown on His head. There'll be a sword in His hand, and He will know how to use it. He will crush all of our enemies, just like Isaiah said. He will rule and reign. His kingdom will be established, and there'll be no end. You thought David was all that? You ain't seen nothing. Wait till you see the Messiah. They formed in their mind who He was, but when He came, He was not recognizable to them, because when He came, He was too much like you and I. He was one of us.